okay, Jesus, this each day costs like $200,000 or something, and you get there and it's like, I had imagined it. We shot really early in the morning because I'd imagined the sun was going down and it was like this celebratory thing, and it was overcast.
These are the things Mike Judge and the cast only began to talk about after years of silence surrounding a film that quietly took over the memory of an entire generation. Office Space. A movie in which anyone who has ever worked an office job sees themselves when a stapler goes missing, when a flat, monotonous voice speaks from behind your back, or when the printer jams at the exact moment you need just one more page to finally go home. As time passed, Office Space refused to die, surviving in ways no one anticipated. Long after box office pressure and contractual obligations had faded, the cast and crew finally began to speak about the things they couldn't say when the film was first released. That an iconic prop was created out of desperation, that the lead actor was nearly replaced by an Oscar-winning star, and that a few decisions that seemed minor at the time, changed only slightly, could have erased Office Space altogether. Below are 15 behind-the-scenes secrets of Office Space told through the voices of the cast themselves. 15. Stephen Root reveals the red stapler was really just spray paint. Do you remember the first time you truly noticed the red stapler? You may not recall exactly when, but in a film washed in grey, your eyes always landed on it. A small, insignificant object that kept reappearing as if it were trying to say something. In the world of Office Space, Milton has his desk taken away, gets moved around, and is spoken to as if he isn't even there. And amid everything that's stripped from him, the red stapler becomes the one thing no one has the right to take. Not because it's important, but because it's his. A tiny, trivial object, yet just enough to prove that he still exists. What makes the story bitter is this: the stapler never existed in real life. Stephen Root later recalled, quite casually, that it was nothing more than a prop sprayed with paint when the crew ran out of ideas. Swingline didn't manufacture a red stapler. The props department grabbed a black one, hit it with red spray paint, and placed it on Milton's desk, simply because they needed something off-key in an office world that was otherwise too orderly, too correct. No one expected audiences to remember it. No one expected fans to start asking, "Where's the red stapler?" And no one imagined that 3 years after the film failed theatrically, Swingline would be forced to manufacture one for real, not for art, but because of demand from people who saw themselves in Milton. An object born from behind-the-scenes desperation outlived the film's original release. A tool with no workplace value, no career benefit, no profit. Motive became the one thing that endured in collective memory. 14. Mike Judge admits Milton was based on a real co-worker of mine. The first time you watch Office Space, Milton doesn't seem important. But with every rewatch, you start to notice something: he's always there. Sometimes behind someone else, sometimes in the corner of the room. Milton exists in moments no one pays attention to. The truth is, Milton wasn't imagined, and that's what makes him unsettling. Mike Judge has been blunt about it. He didn't create Milton. He remembered a real co-worker, a real office employee with a flat voice, slumped shoulders, and one small but persistent obsession: his desk being moved. Anyone who's worked in an office understands what that means. It's a quiet signal that you can be relocated, replaced, or erased from the org chart at any time. Judge carried that discomfort into a short animated film that aired on Liquid Television in the early 1990s. Those shorts weren't funny in an entertaining way. They were claustrophobic. They made you laugh and then immediately feel guilty for laughing at someone being slowly crushed. Milton is spoken to like he's air, shuffled around, treated as if his existence itself is a system error, and so something very small, moving a desk, became a collective trauma. Not because it was dramatic, but because everyone has been Milton at least once. 13. Ron Livingston recalls Fox wanted Matt Damon or Ben Affleck, but Judge refused. There's something strange about watching Office Space. You don't want to be Peter Gibbons, but you understand him instantly. Peter is a blank character, and the more you watch, the more you realise how radical that choice was. Real life isn't full of failed geniuses. It's full of people so ordinary no one writes movies about them. When I learned the studio wanted to replace Peter with an Oscar-winning star, it suddenly made sense. Office Space almost became a completely different movie, one I probably wouldn't have seen myself in. Fox was targeting Matt Damon or Ben Affleck, the faces of Good Will Hunting. Symbols of the wasted genius. Actors who walk into a frame and instantly convince you they're special. But Peter Gibbons couldn't be special. He had to be terrifyingly average. A man who doesn't hate his job because it's hard, but because it's empty. Ron Livingston entered the audition not with leading man energy, but with something far more dangerous: resignation. He didn't perform exhaustion. He carried it. That face promised nothing about what might happen next, and that's exactly why it was right. In hindsight, casting Livingston mirrors how offices actually work. The most essential people are often the ones no one notices until they're gone, and the emptiness of the system is exposed. And perhaps that's why Peter Gibbons has stayed with us longer than any Oscar-winning star ever could. 12. Jennifer Aniston is blunt. The studio wanted me to sell posters. There was a time when you couldn't turn on the TV without seeing Jennifer Aniston. So when she appeared in Office Space, I didn't think of Joanna as a character. She was just a tired waitress standing amid loud music, forced laughter, and meaningless rules. It was only much later that I realised her presence so perfectly measured was no accident. At the time, Ron Livingston was the lead. But to the studio, he wasn't a face that sold tickets. Fox needed a familiar name. A face that once printed on a poster told audiences exactly what kind of movie they were about to see. And Jennifer Aniston was that name right when Friends was at the peak of its cultural power. Aniston later spoke very plainly. The role was originally small. Joanna existed mostly to reflect Peter's life. But once she joined the project, the studio began pushing to expand the part, not because the story needed it, but because marketing did. Aniston filmed for only about 2 weeks, squeezed between Friends shoots. But her exhaustion didn't need to be acted. It felt like the fatigue of someone who has worked late shifts, counted down the minutes to closing time, and still had to express herself in ways defined by others. Joanna isn't a major character, but she's the clearest proof that Office Space understood something very well. Exploitation doesn't exist only in offices. It's everywhere, just in different uniforms. 11. Gary Cole recalls the studio watched it and asked why everyone looked sleepy. During production, Fox constantly sent notes: more energy, faster pace. Why does everyone look so tired? To them, a comedy needed. Peaks, big reactions, obvious emotions. But Mike Judge understood something else. In real offices, people don't scream from despair. They slowly run out. Gary Cole recalled that the studio's reaction to Lumbergh was almost panic. The flat voice, the long pauses, the way his speech killed the air in the room to executives that meant bad acting. To Judge, it was the heart of the film. Lumbergh didn't need to shout. He was frightening because he didn't need emotion. He wasn't angry or villainous in the traditional sense. He simply existed like a procedure, like a missent CC email that still causes damage. The studio wanted Ron Livingston to look more like a leading man, lose weight, look brighter. Judge refused. Peter Gibbons wasn't allowed to shine. He had to look like someone staring into emptiness while his fingers kept typing. That conflict extended all the way to the music. The Ghetto Boys rap tracks were heavily opposed for being inappropriate. But audiences understood immediately anger doesn't need logic, it needs release. In hindsight, the very things the studio feared, the silence, the slowness, the boredom, are what allowed the film to survive. Because that is the state of existence for millions of people. 10. David Herman reveals, "That insult came from my girlfriend." Some lines sound funny at first, but over time they lodge themselves in memory. "No talent-ass clown" is one of those lines. What's interesting is that it wasn't in the script. Originally, Michael Bolton's rant directly targeted the real singer. But the legal risks were too great, so cutting it was inevitable. desperate for a replacement. David Herman asked his girlfriend, and what she blurted out became one of the most durable insults in pop culture. Herman later said he needed a line that was sharp enough but safe enough. Mike Judge heard it and kept it instantly. It had rhythm. It had childishness. And most importantly, it was emotionally correct. It captured the resentment of someone trapped with a name he hates. The real Michael Bolton disliked the line at first, but time worked its magic. 10 years later, he was signing DVDs as the real Michael Bolton parodying himself. In 2019, the phrase entered the Merriam-Webster dictionary. A line born in a living room, not a boardroom. Just a very human moment, and precisely because of that, it outlived the original script. 9. Mike Judge recalls Fox hated gangster rap in a movie about office workers. There's a familiar paradox when looking back at the late 1990s. The people who looked the most harmless often carried the deepest anger. Office workers in 1999 didn't smash things, didn't protest in the streets, didn't scream. They wore button-down shirts, clipped on ID badges, sat in front of CRT monitors, and swallowed their frustration whole. But that didn't mean they weren't angry. It just meant no one had given them a language to release it. Then, in Office Space, that language appeared not through dialogue, but through Houston gangster rap. When Mike Judge chose music by the Ghetto Boys, Fox strongly objected. To them, rap didn't belong with collar-wearing programmers. But Judge understood something market research couldn't measure. Anger doesn't care what you wear or what you do for a living. The scene of three men dragging a printer onto a lawn and smashing it to rap music isn't a joke. It plays like a ritual, a rare moment where rage is allowed to exist without justification. Willie D later said the scene was about resisting the system. And that's exactly right. Not a grand political or social system, but the small, everyday, one-broken machines, meaningless procedures, the things that constantly demand you suffer in silence. 8. Comedy Central confirms we aired it over and over, and it came back to life. In February 1999, Office Space opened in theatres and barely left a trace. It passed through like a missent CC email present but unanswered. The box office numbers were enough to avoid being called a disaster, but not enough to make anyone happy. Fox wanted the next Austin Powers. What they got was a movie whose most memorable line was, "Yeah, I'm gonna need you to come in on Saturday." At the time, everyone assumed the film was finished. But Office Space didn't die. It showed up on VHS DVD and especially on Comedy Central aired repeatedly without hype, without expectations. And there, the film found where it belonged. Small living rooms, dorm rooms, rented apartments, evenings spent turning on the TV with no idea what to watch. With every airing, the ratings climbed. People recognised TPS reports. They understood a case of the Mondays. They wanted The Red Stapler. A movie about workers labelled as lazy only succeeded after years of doing nothing but existing on cable television. It was a very Office Space kind of victory. Not loud, not celebrated, but persistent enough that no one could deny it. 7. Mike Judge recalls angrily the poster looked like an Office Depot ad. There's a moment when a film's fate is almost decided the first time you see its poster. For Office Space, that moment was a long slide downhill. The original poster, featuring a man covered in post-it notes with the tagline "Work Sucks," looked more like an Office Depot advertisement than a movie. Mike Judge saw it and immediately knew his film had been completely misunderstood. This wasn't a joke about work. It was the feeling of being trapped in work, but marketing needed a simple message. The simpler it was, the easier it was to sell, and so the satire died right on the packaging. The peak of that disconnect was the Times Square promotion. Locking a man in a glass box for 5 days. A satire about office misery marketed through real office torture. Only after the film flopped did Mike Judge regain control for the DVD release. He changed the cover. Just Milton peeking out from behind, clutching the red stapler. Strangely enough, fans recognised it instantly. Because that was Office Space. Sometimes a movie doesn't need better advertising. It just needs to be understood correctly. 6. Gary Cole reveals. There was a scene where Lumbergh completely lost it and Judge cut it out. There's a kind of character who becomes more frightening the quieter he is. Bill Lumbergh is that kind of character. The first time I watched Office Space, I didn't think he was scary. He spoke in a voice so flat it drained the air from the room. But the older I got, the more I realised that calmness is the real power. Years later, Gary Cole revealed that there was once a scene where Lumbergh completely lost control, screaming when his Porsche was towed away. A very human reaction. A moment where the audience could have said, "Oh, so he gets angry just like the rest of us." But Mike Judge cut it outright. Not because the scene was bad, but because it destroyed the character's core. Lumbergh was never allowed to vent. He exists like a process, like a CC'd email, like a voice coming from a system. His power lies in the fact that he feels nothing at all, by keeping Lumbergh calm, even when he loses the thing most precious to him. Judge turned him into something far more terrifying, a person who can destroy you without hating you, someone who doesn't see you as an enemy but as a line item in a procedure. 5. David Herman says it plainly, PC Load Letter was real, I wasn't acting. There are moments in movies that make you laugh because they're too accurate. Not because they're well written, but because you've been there. PC Load Letter is one of those moments. The first time I heard it, I didn't know what it meant, but I instantly understood the confusion and the irritation. And the moment when your brain gives up on logic and switches to the urge to smash whatever is in front of you. David Herman later said very clearly that wasn't acting. The HP printer really displayed that message. He genuinely had no idea what it meant. And the half-finished curse that comes out of his mouth is simply the reflex of someone too exhausted to be polite anymore. Mike Judge kept the moment because it wasn't comedy. It was field documentation. The sound of every office at 4:45 on a Friday afternoon when you just need to print one more page so you can go home. PC Load. Letter isn't a punchline. It's a symbol of a system designed without caring whether users understand it. And Michael Bolton's reaction isn't explosive rage, it's a very small collapse, one that everyone has experienced. 4. Todd Duffy recalls bitterly, I sued Fox and I lost. Brian, the overly enthusiastic waiter, only appears in a few scenes. But anyone who has worked in service remembers him clearly. He's the ideal employee, the system loves most, always smiling, always positive, always expressing himself the right way. When Office Space was released on DVD, Brian returned not on screen but on merchandise. His face appeared on the Office Space box of Flair, becoming part of the commercial joke. And Todd Duffy, the actor who played him, didn't find it funny. He sued Fox, arguing that his image had been used without permission. And the court dismissed the case for a very simple reason. His contract allowed the studio to use his likeness throughout the universe. The phrase sounds absurd, but it's also very Office Space. A dry, indifferent clause that covers every possible scenario, just like the system the film itself is mocking. A character who represents meaningless enthusiasm ends up crushed by a meaningless clause in the very movie about people being crushed by systems. 3. The cast admits. We deliberately swore more to avoid a PG-13 rating. There was a period in Hollywood when everything had to be just right, never too uncomfortable, never too alienating. PG-13 was that safe boundary, and Fox wanted Office Space on the safe side of it. On paper, it made sense, less profanity, easier ticket sales. But for the people standing in front of the camera, it felt like a very specific insult. Because no one who has ever been trapped in office hell speaks politely. David Herman recalled that when he heard the studio wanted a PG-13 rating, his reaction wasn't resistance. He chose a different tactic. Make cutting impossible. Add more profanity. More than could realistically be cleaned up in post-production so the film would stay true to real life. Mike Judge didn't object. He understood that sanding down the language would turn Office Space into something painfully familiar, a movie about work made by people who don't actually hate work. The strategy worked. The film kept its R rating, but more importantly, it preserved the suffocating rhythm of frustration. The swearing isn't punchlines, it's steam hissing out of a pressure cooker that's been left on the heat for far too long. 2. Mike Judge is honest. Just thinking about a sequel gives me hives. When Office Space went from flop to cult, hit the question of a sequel was almost inevitable. Fox saw strong DVD sales, cable reruns with solid ratings, lines being quoted everywhere. To them, it looked like a brand waiting to be exploited. But to Mike Judge, the idea made his skin crawl. He once said that just imagining going back into that process executive, notes forced, pacing, forced tone, forced more energy triggered a physical reaction. And that in itself is very Office Space. When a job gives you hives just by thinking about it, you know you shouldn't go back. Judge understood what the studio didn't. Office Space isn't a world meant to be expanded. It's a mental state. Repeating it as a formula would kill what made it alive. Peter Gibbons isn't a character who needs to continue his journey. He represents the moment when someone stops and is no longer afraid. Stretching that moment into a franchise would turn it into just another overtime shift. So Judge said no, and perhaps that was the most Office Space lesson he ever practiced in real life. 1. Mike Judge recalls the decisive moment NBC called about The Office, and I closed the folder. A few years later, another Office came knocking. NBC approached Mike Judge about developing the American version of The Office. They sent materials along with promises of a critically beloved project. For almost anyone else, it would have been a golden opportunity. Judge read through them and stopped at one sentence. The Office succeeded where films like Office Space failed. Just one sentence. But for Judge, it was enough to shut down any possibility of collaboration, because it showed they never understood Office Space to begin with. His film didn't fail at anything. It simply wasn't designed to win by television's rules. It didn't need fast pacing or constant punchlines. It existed to reflect a feeling, one that can't be packaged into a weekly sitcom. Office Space stayed exactly where it belonged. A film that doesn't shout, doesn't try to prove its importance, but whispers long enough that people eventually listen. Office Space never tried to teach you how to rebel. It simply showed you what it feels like to stop being afraid even for a moment, to stop believing everything is urgent, to stop believing your worth lives in reports, deadlines, or CC'd emails. And maybe that's why more than 2 decades later, the film still lingers, not as a comedy, but as a quiet nod exchanged between people who've been tired before. If Office Space ever made you see yourself in it, even briefly, leave a comment which scene detail or line spoke to you the most. And if you want us to keep digging into films that seem light on the surface, but leave marks that last, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next episode.